Most people believe they can recognize success the moment they see it. They assume wealth has a certain look, that intelligence carries a certain appearance, and that important people somehow announce themselves before they ever speak a word. But history has a strange way of exposing how wrong we can be. Sometimes the person standing quietly in the corner of the room is carrying a story so remarkable that it would leave everyone around them speechless if they only knew the truth. And today's story begins with a man who spent more than a decade pushing a janitor's cart through the halls of a school where almost nobody bothered to learn his name. Students laughed when he walked by. Parents rarely acknowledged him. Even some teachers treated him as though he were invisible. To them, he was simply the janitor. A man in a faded uniform who cleaned up after everyone else. But what nobody realized was that this quiet man was hiding a secret that would eventually shock an entire community and force hundreds of people to question the way they judged others. Because the man they mocked every day was living a life that nobody could have imagined. And when the truth finally surfaced, many of those same people wished they could take back every careless word they had ever spoken. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The story begins in a small American town where everybody seemed to know everybody. It was the kind of place where news traveled quickly and reputations lasted for years. At the center of the town stood Jefferson High School, a large brick building that served generations of local families. Every weekday morning before the sun appeared above the horizon, a man named Daniel Brooks arrived at the school carrying a thermos of coffee and a small lunch bag. He always parked in the same corner of the parking lot. He always entered through the same side door. And he always started his day the same way. Long before students filled the hallways with noise and conversation, Daniel was already working. He swept floors, emptied trash bins, polished surfaces, repaired broken desks, and prepared classrooms for another busy day. He performed every task carefully, almost as though he took pride in details nobody else would ever notice. Yet despite his dedication, Daniel remained largely unseen. Most students passed him without a second glance. Others openly mocked him. Teenagers can be cruel when they believe there are no consequences for their words, and many students viewed Daniel as an easy target. To them, he represented a life they never wanted for themselves. A future they feared. A symbol of failure. And because they knew nothing about him, they felt free to make assumptions. One afternoon, a group of students sat near the gymnasium discussing their plans after graduation. They talked about prestigious universities, successful careers, expensive cars, and luxurious homes. As Daniel pushed his cleaning cart past them, one boy laughed and pointed toward him. The others quickly joined in. They joked that if they failed their classes, they could always end up pushing a mop for a living. The group erupted in laughter. Daniel heard every word. He simply smiled politely and continued walking. The students interpreted his silence as weakness. What they didn't understand was that Daniel had spent years learning something most people never discover. He knew that the opinions of strangers lose their power when you understand your own worth. But even though he ignored the comments, there was one student nearby who noticed the exchange differently. Her name was Emily Carter. Unlike the others, Emily paid attention to people. She noticed how Daniel never responded with anger. She noticed how he treated everyone respectfully, even those who insulted him. And she noticed that there seemed to be something unusual about him. There was a calmness in the way he carried himself. A confidence that didn't seem to match the assumptions everyone else had made. It was as if he knew something the rest of the world didn't. Over the following months, Emily found herself becoming increasingly curious about Daniel. Occasionally she would stay after school to finish assignments or participate in extracurricular activities. During those quiet afternoons, she often saw him working alone. Sometimes he repaired equipment. Sometimes he organized storage rooms. Sometimes he simply sat on a bench reading books while taking a short break. What surprised Emily most was the kind of books he read. They weren't novels or magazines. They were books about economics, investing, leadership, psychology, and business strategy. One day she finally gathered the courage to ask him about it. Daniel smiled and invited her to sit beside him. What started as a brief conversation quickly became an hour-long discussion unlike anything Emily expected. Daniel spoke thoughtfully about financial discipline, long-term thinking, personal responsibility, and the importance of treating people with dignity regardless of their social status. He explained complicated ideas with remarkable clarity. Every answer seemed to reveal another layer of knowledge that nobody would expect from a school janitor. By the end of the conversation, Emily walked away with more questions than answers. Who exactly was this man? Why was someone so intelligent cleaning school hallways every day? And why did he seem completely unconcerned with what anyone thought about him? As the months passed, Emily continued speaking with Daniel whenever she had the opportunity. Their conversations became one of the most valuable parts of her week. Daniel never claimed to be an expert. He never bragged about accomplishments. Yet every story he shared contained lessons that felt drawn from real experience rather than theory. He spoke about business failures as though he had personally lived through them. He discussed investment decisions with the confidence of someone who had spent decades in financial markets. He described leadership challenges in ways that suggested first-hand knowledge. Slowly, Emily began realizing that Daniel's life was far more complicated than anyone imagined. Yet whenever she asked direct questions about his past, he politely changed the subject. Meanwhile, the rest of the school remained unaware of the mystery unfolding around them. Students continued making jokes. Parents continued overlooking him. Teachers continued assuming they knew exactly who he was. And Daniel continued arriving every morning before sunrise, quietly performing his duties without complaint. Then something happened that changed everything. Jefferson High School entered one of the most difficult financial periods in its history. Budget cuts began affecting nearly every department. Programs faced elimination. Staff worried about potential layoffs. Sports teams feared losing funding. Parents attended emergency meetings searching for answers. The school administration worked desperately to find solutions, but the numbers looked increasingly alarming. Rumors spread throughout the town. Some believed the school would recover. Others feared lasting damage. For months, uncertainty hung over the community like a dark cloud. Students worried about opportunities disappearing before their eyes. Teachers feared losing programs they had spent years building. Nobody knew how the situation would end. Then, just as hope seemed to be fading, the school board announced a special community meeting. Attendance was strongly encouraged. The announcement offered few details, only hinting that significant news would be shared. Naturally, speculation exploded across town. People wondered whether the school had secured government assistance or found a corporate sponsor. Nobody imagined that the answer would come from the least expected source imaginable. The auditorium was packed on the evening of the meeting. Parents filled rows of seats. Students gathered in groups. Teachers lined the walls. Community leaders occupied the front rows. The atmosphere was tense as everyone waited for answers. Finally, the principal stepped onto the stage. He thanked the crowd for attending and spoke briefly about the challenges facing the school. Then he paused. The room became silent. The principal explained that a donor had come forward with an extraordinary offer. This individual had agreed to provide enough financial support to preserve critical programs and protect opportunities for future students. Murmurs spread throughout the audience. People exchanged confused glances. Who could possibly make such a contribution? The principal smiled and turned toward the side of the stage. Then he invited the donor to join him. A few seconds later, Daniel Brooks walked into view. At first, many people assumed there had been a misunderstanding. Some even laughed nervously. But as Daniel approached the microphone, the reality of the moment began sinking in. The room fell silent. Hundreds of eyes remained fixed on the man they thought they knew. What happened next left the audience stunned. Daniel calmly explained that years earlier he had founded a small company with a friend. Through patience, smart investments, and years of hard work, the business had grown far beyond anything they initially imagined. Eventually, Daniel sold his ownership stake for an amount that secured his financial future many times over. Yet instead of retiring, he chose a different path. He spent years volunteering, mentoring young people, and working jobs that kept him connected to everyday life. Becoming a school janitor was never something he was forced to do. It was something he chose. He explained that the role allowed him to remain involved in the community while observing the next generation. More importantly, it reminded him of a lesson he never wanted to forget, that every person deserves dignity regardless of their title, income, or position. As Daniel continued speaking, many audience members lowered their heads. They remembered jokes they had laughed at, assumptions they had made, judgments they had passed. Suddenly, the man they had viewed as insignificant stood before them as one of the most successful and generous individuals in the entire town. The story quickly spread beyond Jefferson High School. Local newspapers covered the revelation. Television stations requested interviews. Social media exploded with reactions from people amazed by Daniel's humility. Yet perhaps the most powerful impact occurred inside the school itself. Students began seeing him differently. Teachers spoke with him more often. Parents introduced themselves and thanked him for his generosity. But Daniel remained exactly the same person he had always been. He continued arriving before sunrise. He continued cleaning classrooms. He continued greeting students with a smile. Wealth had never defined him before, and public recognition wasn't about to define him now. In many ways, the greatest lesson wasn't that Daniel was secretly wealthy. The greatest lesson was that his character never changed whether people respected him or ignored him. He treated others kindly when they valued him and when they dismissed him. He understood something many people spend their entire lives chasing. True worth doesn't come from status. It comes from who you are when nobody is watching. Years later, former students would continue telling the story of Daniel Brooks. Some remembered the shock of discovering his secret. Others remembered the wisdom he shared in quiet conversations. But almost everyone remembered the lesson. The janitor everyone mocked turned out to be the person who taught them the most important truth they would ever learn. You cannot measure a person's value by their job title. You cannot determine someone's story by looking at their clothes. And you should never assume that the person standing quietly in the background has nothing to offer. Because sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones nobody thinks to notice. And sometimes the person sweeping the floor is carrying a story more powerful than anyone in the room could ever imagine.